All right, we have Bible study started.
Where's your next trip? Where to be?
Let's go to Amsterdam. In spring.
All right. All right, so we're continuing our series on the modern philosophies, the mess they make, and in contrast with that, the incarnation of Jesus and how they compare. Oh, I changed the title to Moral Relativism and Existentialism, but I changed my mind. We're not getting to existentialism yet, but maybe I'll just tack that on to the end of this slideshow after we do this one, and that way the title will technically be true. There's some connections between the two of them, but we'll focus on moral relativism today. So here's one definition of moral relativism. It's a view that rejects the existence of any objective, absolute, or universal moral truths that govern our morality. Notice any universal ones. One guy that wrote about this was named William Graham Sumner, and he described two things that he called folkways and mores. The folkways he described as the customs or conventions of daily life. Those are things that are mildly enforced. We'll talk about this in a second. Mores are strictly held beliefs about behaviors that are, not just mildly enforced, but rather strictly enforced. So here's an example of a folkway that he would talk about. If someone comes up to you and reaches out their hand to shake, what do you probably do? You probably shake it back. Now, during COVID, that kind of changed some of that to some degree, but for the most part, it's kind of like, just back to normal. Well, what if you went up to someone and you went up to them to shake their hand, you just said hello, a normal greeting, and then what if they screamed and ran away? Or what if they said, "Take me to your leader"? Or some other weird or unexpected thing, okay? You wouldn't think, that person needs to go to jail, but you would think, that was weird. That was unusual. Like that. Yeah, that's an example of a folkway. We have habits that we've developed that are like the ordinary ways that we do certain things, and we think it's odd, right, if somebody goes against it. Then you have things that are really expected, and there's a bit of a spectrum in between there. But even with you could probably think of other examples that are similar where sometimes, have you ever met somebody who clearly likes to do things that make people uncomfortable? Yeah, you could tell they get a kick out of it. They get a kick out of doing things that make you uncomfortable, and they do it because they like to make people uncomfortable. There's obviously a moral issue behind that, right? Enjoying making people uncomfortable isn't a kind thing to do, right? But not everybody who is weird is doing it because they want to make people uncomfortable. Sometimes people are just unique, right? Well, you could also have people who might do something weird I'm not, okay, I don't have to deal with this. I'm not in the business world. But you see in TV shows and stuff, I don't know whether any of this really happens, but people will do power moves, They'll do stuff. What it essentially is a violation of some kind of folkway, where maybe somebody holds out their hand and they just turn and ignore it, or they just do something, or we're going to have a meeting at this time and they show up 15 minutes late. They're trying to establish their superiority, their power position. Those are intentional breakings of folkways for that kind of thing. All right, well, I think we could all recognize that that's true and that things like that are not universal, right? How you greet somebody, whether you shake a hand or bump an elbow or wave or whatever, those are often cultural, those can be changing. There's nothing universal about any of that because that's not really morality. That's just a custom. Okay, well, you've probably seen this meme before. Gets used all the time. And I'm pretty sure it was staged, but of course we would look at this and we wouldn't say that this is a folkway. This is something more serious, right? Now, this wouldn't be considered as serious as if he actually cheated on, let's say this is his wife, with her, but people do pretty much universally think that even this is wrong. And we're going to talk about some contrasts with this, but I would say this is an example, what we're going to get into, of how moral relativism is obviously untrue. Everyone sees this behavior as immoral. Maybe not as immoral as certain things, but everybody looks at this and says, well, that guy's like not being a good person. Of course, actually, cheating would be considered more serious. There are situations or cultures where such behavior has not necessarily been considered immoral, even cheating. Well, let me take that back. Are there any situations where polygamy is considered okay? Yes. However, notice a couple of things about this. First, let's take a famous example. Anybody guess who that is? I mean, I don't know why he has a mullet. But yeah, that's Jacob. That's Jacob. All right, so in the Old Testament, Jacob meets his cousins. Those are his cousins. But that, by the way, is an example of a folkway. Maybe a little more than that. Today, no, it is more than that, but it depends on the time. In their day, marrying your cousin or even your like half-sibling was not considered by anyone to be a moral issue. And the reason it wasn't considered to be a normal issue is really, there's two things to it. One, it was normal, okay, so people are used to this idea. And the reason why it was normal is because no one had ever said it was bad, yet. The reason why it becomes immoral is because at a certain point, God says, now we're not doing this anymore. And there are some pretty obvious reasons why it would be okay for a while and then not okay. Anybody know what those would be? What's the problem with like incest? It becomes a genetic issue. Just ask like any of like the kings of Europe in the Middle Ages, right? It became a big problem in those royal houses. They had all kinds of like weird issues because of it. Well, when God creates Adam and Eve, obviously their children married each other, right? Obviously it wasn't a problem. And it wasn't a problem because they have a full gene pool. So as time goes on, the gene pool gets more problems in it. There's more different things that are going on. And so then God makes a law about it. But that's not even the main thing I'm looking at here. So Jacob meets these sisters, Rachel and Leah, and he immediately loves Rachel. And you know how it goes. Her dad tricks him into marrying Leah first. Then he marries Rachel, and, chaos ensues. Now, in that culture, it wasn't considered unusual or immoral for a guy to have two wives. I've never seen any examples. Most of the cultures where it's not considered unusual for a guy to have two wives, you don't really find examples of a woman having two husbands. But I would argue that even in such cultures, it's still pretty obvious that people have a problem with it. Take Rachel and Leah. Did Rachel and Leah enjoy this arrangement? No. Like, they resented each other. They resented the time that the other one was spending with the husband. Everything turned into a competition. It was jealousy. It was awful. God used this to bless Jacob, but it was pretty clearly bad. And that is even different than, like, cheating. Okay, now this is supposed to be a picture. I was looking for, I Googled open marriage, and this was the picture that they showed up for that. But, you see TV show, people talk about this today. They're like, this all comes from moral relativism. We've evolved beyond the idea of, needing marriage. You'll hear people claim marriage was invented by men to control women. Like, no, it wasn't. They'll be like, marriage was invented and because it was a time when people died at 40 and they just needed to have a partnership. No, it wasn't. Sorry, you're wrong. But they're like, we've evolved beyond that and we can have like open marriages. And you'll see like TV shows now and then where that's kind of the idea. But they kind of give themselves away because in those TV shows, they're always kind of end up exploring how like this is terrible. And it's like never goes well, right? Because they're giving themselves away. There's some moral realism there. Moral realism is the opposite of moral relativism. It's the recognition that there's real objective morality and things that are going on. Now, even in a situation, this is also different than just obviously cheating. So let's say that you talk to somebody who claimed that there's no objective morality in terms of marriage, in terms of sex in marriage. If you ask them, well, what if two people promise that they're in a monogamous relationship and then one of them cheats on the other one? Is it wrong? They are going to say yes. And if they don't, they are liars. Because not only is this a rejection of marriage mores, but it's also a rejection just of truth. Now, what about that? What about lying? Every culture I've ever heard of thinks of lying as wrong. And back up for a second here to describe something about moral relativism. Moral relativism can apply to an individual person or to a group. Most of the time when people talk about moral relativism, they're talking about a group. They'll say the way that morality varies from one culture to another. And people today, most of the time, aren't talking about each person's individual, but we'll talk more about this later. They're not usually talking about each person's individual right to decide what is moral, but like a community's right. And they'll decide for themselves what is moral, at least for them, right? But everyone I've ever heard of thinks that lying is wrong, but they usually make some exceptions. Can you think of any exceptions that people make to lying being wrong?
Well, sometimes, if someone's feelings are in jeopardy, if you're...
Yep.
You should say that's really ugly.
Yep.
Maybe you don't say it's ugly.
Sure. However, I would point out that isn't lying. Simply not telling someone what you think about something isn't lying, right? Especially when you're just talking about personal opinion. So, first of all, obviously simply withholding information isn't necessarily lying. There are situations where it can be, right? Like if you're in court and you've been sworn to tell the whole truth about something and you don't, that is a type of lying. But if you think that somebody is wearing something that looks garish and you just don't say that because you're being kind, that's not lying. Now, you might be talking about if somebody asks you, how does this look? There, too, you don't necessarily have to say what you think because what you feel about something isn't necessarily truth. Right? That's not necessarily lying. You could decide to lessen it, although if the person is asking you what you think, they probably want to actually know to some degree, just not in a mean way, right? There's a lot of variations of this. Yeah, people notice that there are some situations where they consider lying to be okay. They usually call it a white lie, right? Can you think of any examples in the Bible where somebody lies and it seems to be the right thing to do? I'm going to put you in a situation, a real life situation that a lot of people faced. And maybe it'll also make you think of something that happened in the Bible. Let's say you're a Christian in Germany in 1940, and you've taken in your Jewish neighbors and you're hiding them. And the Nazi police come knocking on your door and they ask you, are you hiding any Jews here? What's the one that it reminds you of in the Bible? It reminds you of Rahab and the spies, okay? So they come and ask you, do you have any Jewish people hiding here? You know what they're going to do, okay? Obviously, as a Christian, you should protect your neighbor. You should disobey the government in this situation and protect your neighbor. So if you tell them that you do, you are violating the fifth commandment, aren't you? But if you lie, you're lying, aren't you? Do you notice, though, that there isn't actually a commandment that says you shall not lie? Instead, it says you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, because the purpose is a little bit different. There are passages that talk about the problems with lying as well. But the commandment itself focuses you on protecting your neighbor. Now, with Rahab, Hebrews 11 calls what Rahab did an act of faith. Rahab hides the spies, and then they come looking for the spies, and she says they're not here. By the way, here's my take on this. My take is not necessarily that lying is justified in that situation. Rather, it's this, that in a sinful world, we sometimes come up against situations where it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Where like either way you turn, you're like, well, that's wrong. And in such situations, Christians want to be acting out of love for God and their neighbor and trusting in Christ for justification, right? You're saying, Lord, if I'm not sure in this situation, but I'm trusting in your word and I'm trusting in your son for forgiveness. And that's why with Hebrews 11, what it talks about, it doesn't say Rahab was perfectly justified in all of her works in terms of justified according to the law. It says that it was by faith. She did this trusting that God's promises to his people were for her. All right. This is from a dumb 90s movie. That's Adam Sandler. Okay, that's what he says. Why does he say that? Somebody's having like a weird dream, and they see Adam Sandler with a pig, and he says, first we eat the pig, then together we burn. Why?
Well,
Anybody know? What? Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know the context there.
You don't need to know the movie
What's in
context.
My
Yeah.
mind is that eating pork was
Yeah.
forbidden.
Yes, and Adam Sandler is Jewish, so that's part of the joke. Okay, so and it's not, of course, it's not just Jewish people. I went to a new sub place opened in Menasha last summer. Everybody was talking about how great it was, so I went to go check it out. It's called Chicago's House of Hoagies, I think. Everybody's raving about this place. So I went up, and my kids, for some reason, the only kind of sub they'll eat is ham and cheese. So I ordered that, and the lady goes, sir, this is a Muslim establishment. And I said, oh. She's like, we don't have ham. I'm like, oh, okay. It was pretty good, by the way, but they don't have ham. So this is one of the things people will point to. You maybe come across people who are like, you Christians, you're saying that homosexuality is wrong because the Bible says so, blah, 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 but do you eat pork? And they act like they've gotcha, right? Do you eat shellfish? They think that they're like experts in the Bible because they've read one odd passage from Leviticus. But they don't understand the way any of this fits together. They don't understand what the ceremonial law is. They don't understand the purpose of it, how it's a picture of Christ, how it's fulfilled in Christ, that God literally said, hey, those laws about food are done now, but the moral laws and sexual ethics and stuff, that's still in play. So people act like this is an example of moral relativism because, it varies from one culture to another. However, the only reason why this was ever a more in any culture is because God decreed it for a while. And the reason it's not in Christian culture is because God undecreed it. And he told us the reason. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Just other examples of cultural mores or folkways. Some of these are like discussion points, right? Like tardiness. Some people might treat that as like a really big problem. Others will be like, it's not that big of a deal. And two people might view it a little differently. Who cares if I'm 15 minutes late? Somebody else might think, what are you doing? You can't be 15 minutes late. That's really more of a folk way. We're paying credit card bills. I thought this one was weird. These showed up on a website where people were talking about this. So like the idea being if you move from one country to another, you can just like ignore paying your credit card bills. And one person argued, well, no one's really getting hurt because it's just like a big company and they got so much money. And it's like, well, yeah, you're still stealing their money, right? You're also still breaking your word. You said you would pay that stuff back, and then you didn't, right? Tax avoidance. By tax avoidance, I don't mean refusing to pay your taxes. I mean people who find loopholes to avoid paying their taxes. Like, for instance, you maybe know this, but basically none of the richest people in America pay any taxes at all. And it's not because the government isn't trying to get them to pay taxes. It's because they have all kinds of weird things that they do to avoid it. Like, what was the one I was reading about? One of them, I think it was about Jeff Bezos, where he takes no salary from his company. And then what he does is he takes out huge loans against his stock interest. And he lives off the loans. So you don't get taxed on loans, and you only get taxed on your stocks when you sell them. You probably know a lot more about this than I do, as would Rachel. But they do all kinds of weird things to avoid taxes. Is that illegal? No. A lot of people view it as immoral, but others maybe wouldn't. Other people might say, hey, if you can get away with it, why not? That was actually like literally a thing like in one of the presidential elections with Trump, right? People are like, you're avoiding paying taxes, these loopholes. He's like, I'm just being smart. Okay, well, That's kind of this thing that people look at differently. Conspicuous consumption was a list there. Like what they mean is like being like obvious and garish about all the things that I got the best stuff and look at we have the best car and like kind of showing off like that. The Bible would definitely clearly say that is sinful. Tipping the server. There are a lot of different views on this. I went to a restaurant with my grandma once. This is an example of a different era coming through. I went to a restaurant with my grandma, and she was of the opinion that you only have to tip if there are tablecloths. And I was like, Grandma, like almost no one has tablecloths anymore, and it doesn't mean that, right? or some people think that, like one person was talking about how he came from Australia, and in Australia you weren't supposed to tip because they had a specific wage. You'll get people who are arguing about that now. First of all, I was a waiter for a long time. I've never understood this. I've never understood when waiters are like, we want a $15 an hour wage. I was like, are you sure? Like, I made a lot better money than that when I was a server, okay? At $2.33 an hour plus tips, I got way better money than $15 an hour. And they're like, well, I don't know. Maybe it's because some of these people are like cranky and bad at their job and they don't get as good at tips. I don't know. But I worked both at a high-end restaurant and at a Red Robin, and in both situations, I made about the same amount of money. So, I don't know. Yeah, sometimes does your day go pretty badly because somebody stiffs you? It happens. Other times, a guy slips you a $100 bill, okay? And you're like, what? This is awesome. So, just more examples of that sort of thing. Okay. Everybody got an idea about why I put this up here? And anybody know what that is? No, it's a honey badger. Yeah. Honey badgers are pretty awesome. They have really thick skin. They're similar to a mongoose in this. They attack snakes. They will eat cobras, all right? That is hardcore. Now, in the honey badger's case, it's mostly their skin is thick enough to avoid some of the bites, and they have like, I think they have some antibody stuff in their blood. Mongooses are, with them, it's more that they're like really fast. They have some of those other things too, but the mongoose is like, honey badgers are pretty fast too. They're kind of similar. Okay, well, he's eating a snake, right? Would anybody ever look at this and say, that's wrong? No. Is there anybody, though, if we like zoomed out this picture and there was a person and he shot the honey badger and then he ate it, is there anyone that would think that is wrong? There are people who think that that is wrong, but do you notice what that supposes? Right? They use this as one of the examples of moral relativism. Well, some people think it's wrong to eat animals, and some people think it's okay. It's moral relativism, they say. But even the people who think it's wrong to eat animals don't think it's wrong for animals to eat animals. What are they therefore assuming? That humans are different than animals. They are assuming that humans have a certain kind of objective morality. So just that comparison tells you that everyone knows that there is objective morality. Even the person who is arguing that there is not obviously kind of does, because they're even talking about morality. And they don't put the same kind of things on the animals. Anybody seen Breaking Bad? So this is a pretty good example, actually, of moral relativism versus moral realism. I don't know whether or not the show creators intended to do this, but basic storyline of this show is this guy at the beginning is just kind of like your normal guy. He's a husband and a father, and he's a science teacher in a high school, and he finds out he's going to die of cancer soon. He doesn't really have money for his family or to pay the bills. So he decides to cook meth and sell it. And throughout the show, this is why it's called Breaking Bad, he basically little by little descends into sociopathy. And by the end of the show, he is like the worst dude, right? Like the worst, and is doing all kinds of really awful things. And he keeps justifying it, little by little. To beginning, I'm doing this for my family. He is an example of moral relativism from the individual. And especially with this is a, I don't know if this is going to play or not. Did it play? No, it did not play. It's supposed to be an embedded video. Well, I'll just tell you what he says. He's talking to his wife at one point, because after a while he kind of pulls he pulls all kinds of people into these sick things that he ends up doing. And he's telling her, he's like, this is why I did it. And she says something like, don't even tell me that you did this for us. And he says, no, I did it for me. I did it because I liked it. I did it because I was good at it. So he's very open about what's going on here. This is what somebody said once, I can't remember the quote exactly or who said it, but they said that you can judge any moral system by the kind of people that it produces. And that the kind of person that moral relativism produces is a sociopath. And so the person who I was listening to an interview where somebody was talking about Breaking Bad and moral relativism, moral realism, and they pointed to that and they said, when I started watching this show, that's what I thought of right away. That this guy starts making these choices, and at first he's just justifying it like, it's for my family, but pretty soon he's doing one thing after another because it gives him power, because it makes him feel good. He makes a ton of money, but pretty soon it's not about the money. You start seeing these scenes where he's got heaps of cash and garbage bags in his garage. He doesn't even know what to do with it, but he's still doing this stuff. It makes him feel powerful. It's pride. That's what happens, right? Because our sinful nature will use this as an excuse to do whatever it wants, to please itself. You also have this, oh, now it worked. Okay. No idea why.
All the things that I did. You need to understand.
I have to hear one more time that you did this for the family.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. I was alive.
By the way, I'm not necessarily endorsing everything in that show. It's not always the best language situations. Don't watch it with your kids for sure. But it is an interesting exploration of that idea. Now, this would be an example of the same thing, but on a social level. Okay? So on the individual level, we'll take anything that we can. We'll use this philosophy to just end up pleasing ourselves, to doing what I want, to doing what I like, to doing what makes me feel good, to doing what makes me feel alive, indulging in pleasures, etc., whatever. Well, in a society, if the society is going to be unhinged from the foundations of the word and moral realism, and by the way, also with Breaking Bad, in the end, the creators are really showing that moral relativism is bad, and they're showing moral realism because there are major consequences for lots of people with all those things. But anyway, in a society, pretty quickly, you can end up rejecting a whole bunch of things and doing a whole bunch of things that are obviously immoral, and it happens in different ways. In the case of the Nazis, some people start off with an idea, and then they take power, and then they slowly impress this on other people. And you can get to a point where, like, a large section of people are like, it's essentially peer pressure, right? Everybody's doing this, but then also what it ends up doing is it gives cover for the sinful nature to say, well, everybody else is doing it, so it's okay. So this kind of groupthink morality that they're claiming is like that societies can do that. This is the kind of thing that it leads to. And there's a lot of examples from that in history, one of them being just the Tower of Babel. So think about what God says with the Tower of Babel. Anybody want to read Genesis 11:4 there for me? Dan, if you want to.
Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.
All right, first of all, notice something here. You can tell when you're reading the text in Genesis that they know that God has told them to spread out over the face of the earth, because they say, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. So they are doing what they are doing intentionally and knowingly in contradiction to what God had told them to do. And they are afraid of it. God has told them to do something, but they fear that it's a bad thing, so let's do our own thing. And they say, let us build ourselves a city, right? And they also say, let's make ourselves a name. All right, what about Genesis 11:6? Christy, would you like to read that?
And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them.
God here is recognizing that this is a bad situation. He understands that people will do this. He understands we have a depraved, sinful nature, and he understands that if people all join together and they're going to have their own for themselves, decide what's moral and what's not, that they're going to do whatever they want. He also understands that people are capable of doing great things, but that they won't do it with morality as the basis. And so it's going to be really, really bad. And that's why he disperses them, lest that should happen. The picture's a little unclear, but can anybody tell what that's a picture of? Biblical event. That is Sodom, yeah. So if you remember the story, the angels go to warn Lot that he needs to get out of Sodom and Gomorrah because God's going to rain down fire from heaven. And as soon as the men of the city hear that there's a couple of visitors, I think it's just 2 men, in Lot's house, they come and demand to be allowed to gang rape them. And Lot actually tries to offer them his daughters instead, which is obviously twisted. Well, here's the thing. You read that and you're like, what in the world? Guess what? It's not the only time in the Bible you find out that people were like that. Because there's a story in the book of Judges where there's this Levite and he has a concubine. And they go to visit this guy in this town in the territory of Benjamin where there's a bunch of Canaanites, right? The Sodom and Gomorrah, those are Canaanites. And God told the Israelites to clean out the Canaanites, okay? And I'll talk again in a second about why. So he comes to this town. There's a bunch of Canaanites, and the people there have been kind of influenced by the Canaanites. Same thing happens. All the men of the city come to the door of this guy, and they demand to be able to, gang rape this visitor. So instead, they toss the man's concubine outside. She gets gang raped all night long and is dead in the morning. The guy opens his door, finds her there, cuts her into 11 pieces, and sends her off to the tribes of Israel to tell them to come and destroy Benjamin. They actually killed every male in the tribe of Benjamin as a punishment from God for this, because they were adopting the ways of the Canaanites. Notice, this is a cultural norm among the Canaanites. They're all like, this is good. We can do this. This is moral. We've decided. This is an example of what happens when moral relativism takes hold. So you get from Walter White and Breaking Bad to Community